You have been told your entire life that food spoils because nature is careless, that anything left outside a refrigerator for more than 2 hours is a gamble, and that the only safe food is food controlled by machines. Rural Chinese households never had that luxury, and many of the techniques they relied on were eventually pushed aside by modern food safety bureaucracies that preferred standardized industrial methods over older, harder-to-regulate ones. Some of those older methods are now being re-examined by scientists who are finding that the people who used them were not reckless. They were precise, in ways that took centuries to refine. Grocery prices keep climbing, supply chains keep breaking, and refrigerators keep failing during storms and outages, and that has sent people looking backward for methods that do not depend on electricity at all. What follows are 8 food preservation techniques developed and refined across different regions of China. Methods that were sidelined as industrial food processing standardized everything into uniform, additive-laden products, and that are now finding their way back into kitchens because they work, because they are cheap, and because they put control back in the hands of the person doing the cooking. The first technique is salt curing using a dry rub and weighted pressing, a method historically used to preserve pork in regions like Sichuan and Hunan before the start of winter. The method calls for rubbing fatty cuts of pork with coarse salt at a ratio of roughly 7% of the meat's weight, packing the meat into a clay or ceramic vessel, and placing a heavy stone or weighted lid on top to press out moisture over a period of 5 to 7 days. The meat is then removed, rinsed briefly, and hung to air dry in a cool, ventilated space for 2 to 4 weeks. It works because salt draws water out of the meat through osmosis, lowering the water activity level to a point where bacteria responsible for spoilage cannot reproduce, while the slow air drying allows beneficial surface molds and enzymatic changes to develop flavor without rotting the interior. In mountainous parts of Hunan, where winters made fresh meat scarce and humidity made uncontrolled drying risky, this pressed and weighted method became the difference between a household having protein through February or running out by the new year. The second technique is the use of rice wine lees as a preservation medium, a practice especially common in Zhejiang province. After rice wine is brewed, the solid fermented rice residue left behind, known as juzao, is not discarded. Instead, raw fish, chicken, or vegetables are packed directly into the lees along with a small amount of additional salt, sealed in a jar, and left to cure for 1 to several weeks depending on the item. The alcohol content, typically between 8 and 15% in the lees, combined with the acidic byproducts of fermentation, creates an environment hostile to most spoilage organisms while infusing the food with a complex, slightly sweet, winey flavor. The mechanism is straightforward chemistry. Ethanol denatures bacterial cell membranes, and the low pH produced by lactic and acetic acid bacteria during the original fermentation adds a second layer of protection. Villages along the Zhejiang coast use this method to stretch a single wine brewing batch across an entire season of meals, turning a brewing byproduct into a second preservation system at no additional cost. The third technique is sun drying using elevated bamboo racks rather than ground-level mats, a small adjustment that made an enormous difference in regions with humid summers, particularly along the Yangtze River basin. Thin slices of meat, fish, or vegetables are laid across racks raised at least a foot off the ground, allowing air to circulate on all sides rather than just the top surface, and the food is rotated every few hours to prevent moisture from pooling underneath. The elevation matters because ground-level drying traps humidity against the underside of the food, creating a microclimate where mold and bacteria thrive even while the top surface appears dry. Airflow on all sides accelerates the loss of surface moisture evenly, pulling water activity down fast enough to outpace microbial growth. Households along the Yangtze, where summer humidity regularly exceeded 80%, depended on this elevated rack system to dry fish and pork during the only season warm enough to do it, since ground drying in that climate routinely failed and ruined entire batches. The fourth technique requires nothing but timing and proximity to a wood fire, and it is smoke curing using residual hearth heat rather than a dedicated smokehouse. In many rural Chinese homes, particularly in Yunnan, meat was hung directly above the kitchen hearth on bamboo poles, where it absorbed smoke and gentle, indirect heat from daily cooking fires over a period of weeks or months, rather than being smoked intensively in a single session. The slow accumulation of phenolic compounds from wood smoke acts as a natural antimicrobial and antioxidant, coating the meat's surface and slowing both bacterial growth and fat rancidity, while the low, inconsistent heat from the hearth keeps the interior gently dehydrated without cooking it through. This method cost nothing beyond the fuel a household was already burning to cook its daily meals, which made it especially valuable in mountainous Yunnan communities, where dedicated smokehouses were impractical and meat needed to last through long, isolated winters. The fifth technique is lime water preservation for eggs, a method most associated with the Hakka communities of southern China and the broader tradition that eventually produced century eggs. Fresh eggs are submerged in a solution of slaked lime, salt, and ash mixed with water, at a ratio strong enough to raise the pH to roughly 12, and left sealed for several weeks to several months depending on the desired result. The alkaline environment denatures the proteins in the egg white and yolk, breaking them down into a gel-like translucent texture while simultaneously creating conditions in which almost no bacteria can survive, since most pathogens cannot tolerate a pH that high. This is the same chemistry, understood empirically long before modern food science explained it, that underlies the now widely available century egg. In areas without consistent access to ice or cold storage, lime preservation allowed eggs gathered in spring to remain edible and safe well into the following winter, a critical buffer during seasons when hens laid fewer eggs. The sixth technique is fermenting mustard greens into suancai using a simple brine, a staple preservation method across northeastern China, particularly in Dongbei households preparing for winter. Whole mustard greens or cabbage are submerged in a salt brine at roughly 2 to 3% salinity, weighted down to keep them fully underwater, and left to ferment at room temperature for 1 to 3 weeks, until the liquid turns cloudy and distinctly sour. The salt concentration is calibrated specifically to favor lactic acid bacteria, which tolerate salt far better than the spoilage bacteria they outcompete. And as those lactic acid bacteria multiply, they produce acid that drives the pH down to a level where almost nothing else can survive, which is the same mechanism behind sauerkraut and kimchi. Northeastern Chinese households relied on this fermentation as their primary source of vegetables once the ground froze, turning a single autumn cabbage harvest into months of usable food without a single calorie of energy spent on refrigeration. The seventh technique is rendering and storing fat in sealed clay jars, a practice that solved both preservation and cooking fuel needs simultaneously in many parts of rural China. Pork fat is slowly rendered over low heat until fully liquid, strained of all solid particles, then poured while still hot into a clean, dry clay jar and sealed once cooled, which allows it to remain stable at room temperature for many months. The key mechanism is the complete removal of moisture and protein solids during rendering, since it is water and protein, not fat itself, that spoilage bacteria need to grow, and a properly rendered, strained fat with no water content becomes nearly inert. Sealing it from air exposure further slows oxidation, which is what eventually turns fat rancid even when bacteria are not a factor. In households where cooking oil was either unavailable or too expensive to buy regularly, a single large batch of rendered lard stored this way could supply both flavor and cooking fat for an entire family through a long winter. Before the eighth and final technique, it is worth pausing on what the previous 7 have in common, because the pattern matters as much as any single method. Reaching the eighth from here. The eighth and final technique is the most counterintuitive of the group, and it is the deliberate use of controlled mold cultivation through koji fermentation, a method central to traditional Chinese soybean and grain preservation that predates almost everything else on this list. A grain such as rice or soybeans is cooked, cooled slightly, then inoculated with spores of a specific mold, traditionally Aspergillus oryzae, and kept in a warm, humid environment for 1 to 3 days, while the mold visibly colonizes the grain, turning it into a fragrant, slightly sweet substance used as the starting base for soy sauce, fermented bean paste, and other long-preserved staples. The mold itself is not the threat people assume molds always are. It produces powerful enzymes that break down starches and proteins into simpler sugars and amino acids, and in doing so it creates an environment so thoroughly colonized by a single beneficial organism that harmful bacteria and dangerous molds are crowded out before they ever get a foothold. The same competitive exclusion principle that underlies cheese rind cultivation in entirely different parts of the world. In regions of China where soybeans were a primary protein source but spoiled quickly in their raw state, koji-based fermentation transformed an unstable crop into pastes and sauces that could be stored for years, becoming the backbone of an entire regional cuisine built on a single controlled mold culture. Step back from these 8 techniques individually and a single underlying principle becomes visible across every one of them. None of these methods are trying to stop biological activity altogether. Modern preservation, by contrast, is largely built on the opposite idea, on sterilizing food and then sealing it away from all biological activity using refrigeration, pasteurization, and preservatives, treating microorganisms as a uniform enemy to be eliminated. Every technique here instead works by selecting for one specific, beneficial form of biological activity, whether that is a particular bacteria, a particular mold, or a particular chemical environment, and then trusting that organism to outcompete everything dangerous on its own. Salt does not kill bacteria so much as it makes the environment favorable to organisms that can tolerate salt while starving out the ones that cannot. Lactic acid fermentation does not sterilize cabbage. It arms a beneficial bacteria with a competitive advantage and lets it win the fight. Koji does not eliminate microbial activity in soybeans. It floods the field with one dominant, helpful organism before anything harmful arrives. This is a fundamentally different philosophy of food safety, one based on ecological balance rather than total elimination, and it is exactly the kind of nuanced, biologically literate thinking that industrial food standards, built around uniform sterilization, were never designed to accommodate or even recognize as legitimate. None of this means abandoning a refrigerator or ignoring real food safety risks, and several of these techniques, particularly lime-cured eggs and dry-cured meats, require attention to ratios and conditions that are easy to get wrong on a first attempt. What it does mean is recognizing that an entire system of food preservation existed and worked reliably for centuries before refrigeration was invented, built by people who had no margin for error and could not afford to guess. The most accessible place to start today is the sixth technique, the simple salt brine fermentation of mustard greens or cabbage, because it requires nothing more than vegetables, salt, water, and a jar, and the first results are visible within a week. Submerge sliced cabbage in a 2 to 3% salt brine tonight, weight it down so it stays under the liquid, and check it in 7 days. What you will be tasting is not a trend. It is a method that fed people through winters with no other option, rediscovered by people who finally ran out of reasons to keep ignoring it